Parneet, thank you for being here with us today. Again, I like to start with a little bit of gratitude. We're here because, mutual friend, but also because there's definitely resonance in the work you're doing and how it's applicable to our community. I thought it only made sense to ask for you to come on the show. You obliged. We're here today. I'm super excited to hang with you for the next hour or so and talk about what you're doing. So again, thank you for your time and being here and sharing anything and everything you have with our audience today.
Thank you so much, Phil. Likewise, the feeling is mutual. Really excited for this conversation.
Oh, I have been so excited since we met. We had that pre-recording call, and I knew this was going to be energetic, and I've been so looking forward to it. So to jump into this real quick, I want to start maybe with a little bit of drama in this conversation. Like most people, I think many people, all of us have like those moments in our life, right? Where it's like, oh man, I realized something or I experienced something or something unfortunate happened in my life. And I've now been given the chance to think, to change. And we've had many guests that have shared this on our show. And those stories for me are important because I think they really are those moments where people get to reflect, which is a big part of our work, and redefine their work, their lives, their relationships, etc. And for you, I'd love for you to bring us into that moment in your life. You mentioned in your about section, in your literature, also when we spoke, that there was this moment, and I'm going to quote it here, when I returned to my true health, when I realized again what true health was in my life. And your backstory obviously has some context to that, which I hope you share too, as maybe a bit of an origin, but take us through that moment, and then also what led up to that moment to get us started today.
Yeah. Well, I've had many crucible moments, but I think one of the first ones where I sort of came up against this question around health and well-being, specifically my own health and well-being, was what I call my quarter life crisis, which was many years ago when I had completed my medical training. So I grew up in India. I went to medical school there, and then I came to the US for my postgraduate training, which included a master's in exercise and movement science, and then residency medical training at Harvard and Columbia. And at the end of all of this fantastic training, and I've always loved biology and health and what the body can do. I really, it's an ongoing, lifelong love story as far as I'm concerned. But I was noticing some interesting patterns. I was noticing one that, being in clinical practice, at least the way that medicine was being and unfortunately still is being practiced globally, was just not aligning with how I wanted to use that information. And to be clear, I have a lot of respect for modern medicine. It is miraculous. It does amazing things. And when I fall sick, I want to make sure that I'm being treated by a state-of-the-art physician in modern medicine. But what I was noticing was that there was a little bit of a disconnect between what the data was showing around what keeps us well versus the way that medicine was being practiced for the most part. So there was that kind of disconnect. I was growing up in India, I had this very integrated sense of what health and well-being means. It was everybody around me, including in my family, meditation was a part of our lifestyle. Yoga was a part of our lifestyle. Spending time with our community and friends was an integral part of our lifestyle. I still remember growing up, if our parents left for like a, weekend away or something, my brother and I were left, we were like little kids, but our parents felt comfortable leaving us to our own devices because they knew that our neighbors and everybody in our community were there to check in on us and take care of us. We literally had like this open door policy. We didn't have to make appointments to see each other and our neighbors. And so, and growing up, and of course, India has a very rich tradition of both philosophy and medicine. So for me, it was always I've always looked out or leaned towards prevention, and that disconnect, that quarter life crisis that I was feeling was this idea that we aren't talking about this. Like nobody's talking about diet or movement or how to manage stress, and the data was showing that all, 75% and above of our healthcare dollars go towards treating chronic lifestyle related disease, which was mostly preventable. 80 to 90% of that is preventable when we pay attention to our lifestyle. So that was one part. So I was kind of, trying to figure that out. I think the other thing that was not clear to me back then, but which has become clear in my journey since, is that I love teaching and I love speaking and communicating ideas. And in the way that I was working back then, I did not have enough opportunity to do that. So I felt kind of misaligned with my passion and my impact in the world. And then finally, as I was trying to sort myself out and try to figure out, what am I going to do with all this education and how can I make an impact in people's lives? Unfortunately, I was confronted with very severe illness in my family. And so, so that was definitely a crucible moment for me to kind of step back and ask myself, what does true health actually mean? And then as I started exploring that question, and I know we'll talk more about this, but trying to understand what beyond the body affects our well-being.
I love that. What a great segue into where I want to go is, you mentioned this, and obviously a lot of people culturally, societally, we're starting to see those things, right? They're becoming more prevalent. I mean, the first thing I think about is the Blue Zones documentaries that are coming out and showing all these different studies with longevity being a big topic in the health and wellness space right now. And a lot of the core tenets are things that you just grew up with in your family life, in your childhood. And exploring those things in adulthood and making that question come to the surface and say, why are these not being kind of the forefront of our health journey? And so that question that you just ended your amazing origin story with, let's go there, because I want to talk about that and unpack a little bit more of that idea, because I think a lot of us still fall into that idea of, I'm just trying not to get sick. I'm just trying not to get sick so I can be well in later stages of my life, and I'm bringing in maybe some of our work into this, and I can retire and I have 12 years of vitality and things like that. I think that's a false story, right? I think that, as you illustrated, it can start from early on, and those tenets can live and make someone really well from childhood all the way until later years of their life. So let's talk about that. Like, what have you seen, and specifically bringing in your training and your education and your work that you've done for decades, bring that into this conversation and share with us, like, what other tenets, and maybe even like, where do they fall on the spectrum in terms of like the definition of well-being?
So I actually like the very boring WHO definition of well-being, which is a complete state of physical, mental, and social health, and not just an absence of disease. And where it gets interesting and not boring is when you start to unpack the layers of what physical, mental, and social well-being actually mean. And especially that social well-being component, because I think a lot of us are very familiar with the physical aspect. Many of us are becoming more aware of the mental aspect, especially in the workplace and especially after COVID, which is all fantastic. Very few of us pay attention to the social aspects. And the social aspect includes everything. Well, maybe a good way to understand this, and one word that I think everybody should start becoming familiar with, and which I try to preach as much as I can and shout from the rooftops, is exposome. And you're going to be hearing about this word more and more, hopefully. So the exposome refers to all of our life exposures from the moment of conception. So not even birth, from the moment of conception till the day that we die. And now, if you start to think about, okay, what are those exposures? You realize, well, definitely, it includes my lifestyle, right? Like my health behaviors, what I do on a day-to-day basis, the food on my plate, whether or not I move, how much I sleep, how I'm managing my stress. But then beyond that, it includes the quality of the air that I'm breathing, the temperature of wherever I might be living, the quality of the water that I'm drinking, the quality of the food on my plate, which depends on the quality of the soil that it's grown in. it includes exposure to what are now, in the literature, I'll call novel entities, which is the hundreds and thousands of man-made chemicals that we are exposed to. So whether that's in our food, in our packaging, the plastics, the cosmetics and personal care products that we expose ourselves to. And so, but then also the sort of more economic determinants that underlie that social well-being. So how much money do I make? What is the state of my workplace? What is the state of my culture at work that I'm exposed to? What kinds of economic opportunities do I have access to or not? Do I have access to healthcare? So all of these exposures are information that our physical body has to navigate every single moment of our lives. And all of these exposures act, sort of maybe like the second concept or word that people should become familiar with is homeostasis. And homeostasis is the ability. It's basic. It's a narrow zone of well-being where it's a zone of pH and temperature and blood glucose and other metabolic parameters that our body has to maintain in order for our cells to survive. So if you think about it, our body, I think, one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about the body is that it's just like kind of like the static system. But actually, it's when you look underneath, and this is what's so fascinating and amazing and so beautiful about our bodies, is that it's this complex, dynamic system. It's this multi-species ecosystem that's in constant conversation with our exposome. And the whole point of this interaction is so beautifully designed by nature and through evolution is, let's make our cells survive. And not just survive, let's make our cells thrive. And in order to do that, our cells have to make sure that they stay in that zone of well-being or homeostasis. And that is what, and so to me, when I think about what is optimal health or well-being, beyond the WHO definition, it's how can we do this dance? How can we maintain this dynamic balance in the best way possible?
Oh my gosh, there's so many roads that we could take from here. I'm going to start with homeostasis because I think that burning question that I'm having in my mind right now is, how do I know that? Like as an everyday individual, right? Like I love that concept, right? And I think that of what you said about the expose, where it's everything that is around you is then affecting you, not just like externally, like your skin, your eyes, health, your taste buds, like all this stuff, but internally, like our biology is changing in response to those things. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to that place now as a curious individual, and I'm sure many listeners are thinking this too, where it's like, wow, like that's true. I feel these things at work, or maybe when I go to this environment or these people that I'm around, I feel different ways. And so how does one begin to understand what homeostasis means to them, but then also know like what variables kind of like tick up or tick down their quote unquote well-being?
Yeah, so there's a lot there, but I think one kind of like the first step that folks who are listening can start to look out for or become aware of is their energy levels, and because that is literally the foundation of how our cells keep themselves alive. And so within the cells, I think, if you hark back to your high school biology days, everybody's familiar with the mitochondria, these cell organelles that are famously known as a powerhouse of the cell, because this is where the food is broken down to produce energy to release. So the chemical energy in the food is converted into different, mechanical and other forms of energy in the body to do work and to keep the cells alive. And this happens in the mitochondria. And of course, mitochondria is like my passion to talk about. And again, we can get into more details later if needed. But for now, within the context of homeostasis, all the exposome and all those external stressors, your mitochondria take in that information and then say, okay, now we need to step up energy production, or depending on the exposome, it's okay. We can relax a little bit and we can repair and recover right now. So it's that balance between growth and repair that is crucial to homeostasis. So when we start to think about, you know, how energetic do you feel? So when you wake up in the morning, do you feel refreshed? Do you feel like you're raring to go and take on the challenges of the day, or are you kind of, do you just feel really lousy? So that's like the most glaring kind of representation of this metabolism. But then we should also keep in mind that because this is a dynamic process and because the body is so brilliant in making up for deficits, often we don't feel that overtly. We don't feel the kind of little, when we start to overshoot these boundaries of homeostasis, it may not be apparent to us immediately. You might have to do a blood test to figure that out. But some other ways that it can show up is just in your moods. Are your moods very labile? Or how is your digestion? Are you falling sick very quickly every time that you travel? So like, what is the state of your immunity? So starting to, what are your blood glucose levels? If that is something, I know a lot of folks in this community probably have continuous glucose, monitors, and they are checking their glucose levels. How is the quality of your sleep? If you had to go work out, like, how do you feel after your workout? Do you feel completely winded, or do you feel really good and energetic post-workout? So there are all these little clues based on our just the activities of our daily living. I think another big clue is the quality of our relationships. And if we find that we're just feeling emotionally drained all the time, in addition to sort of like the mental, maybe anxiety or depression that we might be feeling, I think all of these are clues that ultimately always come down to the quality and quantity of metabolic energy that is being produced in your cells. And that is sort of like the clue around homeostasis. And of course, then there are blood parameters that we can measure.
Sure. That's amazing feedback, right? I mean, I think that's something that's so easy for people to kind of tap into, especially if you're not in this space or have never spent any time here or with your well-being at this level or depth, is that you can really tune in and say, wow, after this, I feel very drained, or I'm fatigued after I do this, or just in general. And I do love the call out you mentioned a minute ago about the brilliance and in the mechanism of our bodies to overcompensate for deficiencies, which to me illustrates how more important it is to understand the level of detail that what you call your lifestyle medicine, like the things you do in your life every day, how they're affecting you and how that could be negatively or positively impacting your well-being, right? Mm-hmm. So I want to go there too for a second, because lifestyle medicine, I think I have an idea of what you mean by that. But I'd love for you to explain that concept, because I think it's probably connected to what we were just talking about with energy, sleep, etc., and how that plays into your homeostasis and your overall well-being.
Yeah, and it's quite simple, really, Phil. So lifestyle medicine, just from the name itself, is everything in all your behaviors as part of your lifestyle that affect your health. And lifestyle medicine is a relatively new field and specialty in medicine that was created maybe about a couple of decades ago. And it basically investigates and calibrates lifestyle behaviors, how you eat, move, sleep, and manage your stress, to the best possible outcome for your energy and for your health. And so a lot of the times, and I think people are actually quite familiar with different aspects of lifestyle medicine already. It's just that they may not have like put them all together to think of it within that umbrella.
Right.
But the good news is that many more people are talking about this, especially within the longevity and health span phase, space. I think a lot of people might be familiar with this idea that it's no longer enough to just live long, because if we're spending most of our lives, especially towards the end of our lives, sort of like the last trimester of our life, if we're just sick or not able to do the things that we want to do, then it's no point prolonging your life. And so how can we increase the number of years spent well and in good health, which is our health span? And so everything in lifestyle medicine is really targeted towards that, is how do you increase your health span? And in so doing, you invariably increase your lifespan as well.
Yeah, I love that I mentioned the longevity space earlier, and one of the things that really stood out to me and my wife as we dove into those topics was the vitality that you still have in those phases of your life, right? That chart that is like, is it a steep drop off, or is it's kind of like the glide path going towards whatever your ending looks like, but you're still vital in those years, even later in life. So I want to ask a little bit more detail about lifestyle medicine, because I think this is really important. And maybe this is maybe the bias or asterisk that connects us in our work and yours. Because I mean, most of us maybe know this, that like a lot of the chronic diseases that are in our world are preventable. A lot of them based on lifestyle choices, our environments, the external factors that are coming into our lives. So what have you seen as some of the most important factors of those lifestyle medicines? And then what have you seen, like conversely, like the other side, like when you don't do these things, or which ones are the most detrimental to your well-being if you don't do them? So could you break that down a little bit for us in terms of like those activities? Like sleep was one you mentioned, community. Are there others in that pie chart that we can really dive into in detail?
Absolutely. And I think before we get into that, one thing to keep in mind as you think about your lifestyle is that, again, just to repeat, our health is a dynamic process. And it's this interaction between the genetic information that you came into this world with, and then your lifestyle, which is all these exposures that you willingly or unconsciously come into contact with. And so every person will probably respond a little bit differently, but there are some general principles that are applicable across the board. So definitely sleep is a big one. And with sleep, it's also a matter of how do we recover and repair well. So I think out of, and diet is another big one, because the quality of the food on our plate is important for so many reasons beyond just our biological health. And this is where the connection to planetary health becomes super important. But but within the context, so and of course, each of these factors we can talk about for hours. But I think one key concept for me is try to think of where am I over-indexing on growth and on not doing enough for repair and recovery. And the way that we work, the way that we live, the communities that we have built, the economies that we have built, unfortunately, we are kind of trapped in the system, whether we like it or not, where we're constantly trying to produce, trying to keep doing more. So in terms of our consumption, we're consuming a lot. We just can't get enough. In terms of our businesses and organizations, there's always this desire for more and more growth at any cost. And then, of course, as leaders and as businesses and politicians, again, we sort of always think about how can we do more. And if we take a step back and realize that our bodies are not separate from nature, so that's the other concept that I'm really passionate about, is to stop saying nature as something outside of us. We are part of nature. And thank goodness for that, because our brilliant biological design is one, again, beautiful example of how nature works. And because of that, nature, when we look at nature, I think what always stands out is, one, nature works on principles of abundance. Nature works on principles of turning waste into food, right? Nature works on principles of biodiversity, on collaboration, on regeneration. And the reason that all of that works really well in nature is because these natural systems honor the limits to their growth.
Wow, very well said.
So this,
Very
yeah.
well said.
So this is really, and it's sort of counterintuitive. How can limiting something, how can a constraint actually help me do better? Because the philosophy that we've been so ingrained with is like, you only get better if I, the more that I do, the better that I get. And then when we look at natural systems, we realize that no, like, impermanence is a key feature. It's not a bug of the natural systems. And everything lives and dies, and the way to health and well-being or prospering, flourishing ecosystems is always when the participants collaborate with each other, and when there is space for a lot of diversity of the constituents. So when we start to think about our body, and I'm trying to see how I got here, but I think we were talking about the principle of repair and recovery.
Right.
So in nature, there's summer, then there's winter, there's day, then there's night. Even in our bodies, when our heart beats, if our heart, for like whatever 70 to 80 years of our lives, our heart beats about 100,000 times every day, it would get, it wouldn't be able to last that long if it did not take time for recovery. And so that's why you have a systole, which is a contraction of each heartbeat, and a diastole, which is a relaxation phase of the heartbeat. So a great question to ask ourselves, or a very practical thing to ask ourselves, is, am I taking enough time for repair and recovery? And repair and recovery can look like many different things. And, I think a lot of people have an intuitive sense. Of course, sleep is part of that. Or, if I just like, at the end of the day, just like sit down and not work and, maybe, I don't know, watch Netflix or scroll through my social media, maybe that is part of my recovery. And certainly it can be. But I also want us to start thinking about, go one layer even deeper, which is from the body's point of view. How can you spend more time with your parasympathetic nervous system rather than your sympathetic nervous system? So so for those who may not be familiar with that, sympathetic nervous system is sort of our drive system. It's also a fear and anxiety-based system. It's a sort of more productivity-based system. And it is very good, and we need it, and we should engage it. But then we also need to switch and have enough time to engage with our parasympathetic, which is our rest and digest system. Because in addition to the literal rest that your system gets, repair. And again, this is something that most folks are not familiar with, or do not know about their biology, is that in your cells, these amazing repair mechanisms and chemical reactions must happen if we don't want junk to accumulate. So the normal process of metabolism every single moment produces some waste products like any other kind of system. And our body has these amazing ways to recycle that waste, or to, if there's DNA damage happening, to repair that DNA damage. So all of this repair and recovery is really, really key for health and well-being. And what we're noticing is the reason why, so again, to tie this back to your question around, how is this affecting our lifestyles and our longevity, is that all of the chronic diseases that we suffer from, everything from heart disease to stroke to neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, to mental health disorders like anxiety and depression, definitely, obesity and type 2 diabetes and so on. The common root cause always comes down to this imbalance between growth and repair, which then results in high levels of inflammation in our cells. And inflammation is just your mitochondria and your cells' attempt to, kind of step up their repair and be like, oh my God, like they're basically overloaded with stress and injury, and they're trying their best, and we get away with a lot. I mean, thank goodness these systems are so amazing. We get away with a lot of that kind of stress, but then there's a limit. So it's really important to respect that limit in our bodies. And in so doing, then, counterintuitively, because those repair mechanisms can come online, then we end up living a healthier life.
Wow. I'm sitting on the other end of the camera here smiling because I'm just like, wow, I'm just taking in all this wonderful information. So thank you for sharing that. And there's a couple of threads there that I think are really important that I want to kind of put my finger on and even take a road down there. One, I love this idea of repair and recovery, right? Because as you mentioned, most of us from childhood probably didn't grow up in an environment like you did. And maybe I'm generalizing or stereotyping a bit, but we probably saw two working parents going to work a job, working 9 to 5, if not longer, coming home stressed, trying to put things around a life to grow a family and this and that. And so like this idea of stress and like always being in that mode of growth, like you said, was kind of ingrained and embodied in a lot of Western culture, where it was like grow, 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 get, do, and never stop. And that cycle continues, right? Unless you break the chain. And so I love this idea of stress being a component too of your life, and that switch between your nervous systems, where you're allowing yourself to kind of do the things you need to do in that drive state, but then also come back into that recovery state and really honoring that as a part of growth. And I think that's really the mindset shift that is probably hard for a lot of specifically like entrepreneurs or business leaders, which we're about to get to here in a second in this conversation, is when you switch that mode off, you're like, I'm not doing anything. I'm not acting. I'm not growing. If I'm not doing it, nothing's happening. When in fact, as you mentioned, like just watch the microscope of nature, right? Like growth happens via repair. It happens in these cycles where the seasons change and leaves fall and then they can rebloom again and the tree is stronger and bigger and all these things happen around us. But again, we diverge ourselves from this idea of connectivity to nature. So those 2 points really stood out, and I just wanted to kind of say them again out loud so that we could really drive them home as the switching of the nervous system and allowing yourself to recover and rest, albeit that's probably a practical, like physical shift. It's also probably a mindset shift for a lot of folks to be able to get out of that state and really honoring the recovery cycles as a part of growth. So thank you for that. That was amazing. I'm already fueled by this. So this is a winning conversation. So I mentioned this a second ago, and you mentioned this, but this idea of like our world and like some of that conditioning that I just ranted about is the business world, right? There's the archetypes that lead economies and lead capitalism and lead businesses. And it feels like there's maybe a paradigm shift happening in that realm right now. You and hopefully us being a small part of that shift for leaders. But for some reason, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, from the companies you've worked with, spoken to, and the leaders you've been engaged with, there's a maybe a divide or a giant canyon between what's been either deemed valuable or shown to be a growth mechanism for the world of business and leadership in general. And terms like well-being or health or energetics or anything like that has really just been overlooked because a lot of the times it's more of the same. It's churn out more things, more cogs in the wheel, more systems enhancements so that we can go faster, further, longer, right? Like that's been the thing. But what you just said doesn't not apply to the business realm because all businesses are just systems of people doing services or building products. So walk us into that realm and what you see in the business world from leaders that you've worked with, and what characteristics are they showing, and what are we needing to begin to address in the world of business, economics, and things even bigger than that?
Oof. Okay. So that's there's so much there. So I'll try to summarize it. And there's so many thoughts that were coming up for me as you were speaking. I think so within so with my company Systematically Well, I work with leaders and organizations on exactly these topics. And my goal is, one, to get them really excited about their biology, but then also to see that if indeed their purpose of their business or their individual purpose is to do good things in the world, whatever industry they might be in, how true is it that their current lifestyle or the ways that their teams are working, how is it actually translating, if they're brutally honest, to the outcomes that they're looking for? And when you actually shine a light on the state of the world today and, we're stuck in this paradigm of capitalism, for better or for worse, at least for now. But thankfully, things are changing. There are many new economic paradigms on the horizon, which I think will be fantastic. But when we look at the outcomes of the state of the world today, very clearly, and I know leaders pride themselves in being sort of very data driven and being able to think very clearly. So for them, something to think about is, number one, on a planetary level, we have exceeded 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries, for those who are not familiar, are the 9 kind of checks that are important for planetary health that allow us to even survive on this planet. And if this were a patient, if the planet were a patient right now, they would be in the intensive care unit. Because if you had 6 out of 9 key biomarkers for survival, in the red range, that patient would be on life support. And this the result. I mean, this outcome is when you trace it back to how did we get there. This is where business leaders, I think, have a fantastic opportunity to increase their impact. And to start to recognize, wow, like when we look at the way that we've been consuming things, producing things, growing our economies, this is the direct result of all of this man-made activity. So that's number one. So we're literally on a crash course to extinction and human extinction, right? The world will survive, nature will survive, no problems there. But if we want our children and our grandchildren to have to be in a livable world, we really need to sit up and take notice. But then even more close to home, within the context of performance and productivity are sort of like the buzzwords that a lot of HR leaders and CEOs care about, and completely fine. Of course, you want your business to do well. And by the way, I also want to preface all this by saying that I have a lot of empathy for leaders in this space, because I think a lot of them are becoming aware of these issues. A lot of them deeply care about these issues. I know they want to do right by their teams. And unfortunately, what's happening is that they're stuck in the system. And so that's why shifting the system is really key, but it's a bit of a catch-22 because the system is made up of people and it's these leaders. And that's what I get excited about when I talk to these leaders is that, wow, you are the folks who have the greatest leverage points in the system. And let's talk about this amazing new paradigm that we can create together. And so within the context of the systems within their business teams, again, when you look at the data, you see that depending on the report that you look at, anywhere from, it's usually about 50% of managers and employees are burnt out. And those rates are increasing. And when you look at the effects of burnout on productivity and performance, as you can imagine, they're not good. So even from a very sort of narrow scope of, I want my business to do well and I want my team members to be creative, to be innovative, to solve the hard problems, to show up with the kinds of energy that they need to show up with, the data is very clear. Like if you have burnt out people, they're basically just sitting there. There's a lot of presenteeism, or they're falling sick. They're racking up your healthcare costs. Your turnover is increasing. Your retention is decreasing. And I think the newer generations, right, like the millennials and the Gen Z and now the Gen Alpha, I think I love that they are coming into this conversation as they start to be active constituents of the workplace, is they're starting to look around and say, hey, wait a second, this system is not working. And the world that you are leaving us with is not something that we like, or is, so I think it's great that those folks, I don't know, and I'm sure you notice this too, is that this idea of work-life balance, or well-being in the workplace, or wellness, or whatever you want to call it, I think that old kind of thinking around it, its time has come. I think we need to just leave it behind and instead shift to this new way of thinking about that our health is an emergent property of the systems that we live in, which includes our biological system, our workplace system, our communities, and our planetary systems. There is a two-way feedback happening across all these systems. And when there's imbalance in any part of the system, it affects everybody else. And so if we have to create businesses and be productive and perform at our best, there's absolutely no way that you can do that if your teams, your communities, and the planet is suffering. So I hope that gives you a little bit of
No, that was
context.
beautiful. And I'm gonna ask a kind of a really direct question after this too. Do your thesis and everything you just said, which again I'm very resonant with, the idea that especially in the world of business, being a component of all systems at play, that it starts with the individual. That the system at large, we have to go to the individual level to look at the health of the leaders, their teams, the people at large in these organizations, because that as a data point and something to focus on is actually one of the most important metrics for us to consider if we're thinking about growth, but then even beyond that, sustainability, and not just for our business, but for, as you put it, humanity, our world.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to start. So like in terms of like practically what can leaders do? I think first, like just start with a huge dose of self-compassion, so for leaders to just like take a pause, because honestly, and again, this is what I'm noticing is with the leaders that I work, that a lot of them are burnt out. And in that state, I think it's really important. Again, this is where our biology becomes so important, is that we also know that in addition to falling sick, in addition to you being at risk for all of those diseases that we mentioned, lifestyle related chronic disease, these states of increased inflammation in our body also affects our decision making. And I think a lot of the times, there's this misconception that, oh, I'll deal with my health because, it's gonna, I'll sleep when I'm dead, or I'll think about it maybe 10 years down the line. And this is for folks who are in their 20s and 30s as well. And the truth of the matter is no, like your biology is being affected in this moment. And you might, and again, thanks to the resilience of your biological system, yes, you may not see the effects, although unfortunately we are seeing across the board cancer rates, obesity rates, diabetes rates, mental health rates in our 20s and our 30s, where we didn't see them, till much later in life. But then when it comes to business decisions, when it comes to how you want to grow your company, it's research shows that even low levels of information affect our moment-to-moment decision making. So it makes us really stuck in this paradigm of short-termism. It's really hard for us to look at the long-term effects of our actions and behaviors in the world, or of the business in the world. And this is why our world, unfortunately, is in the mess that it is. So I think a lot of good reason, and this is what, through my programs, through my learning programs and work with business teams, Systematically Well is a suite of learning programs. So it's everything from masterclasses for the whole organization, where we can start to think about our performance, our productivity, our resilience, our sustainability, our leadership, through the lens of health and well-being and biology, but again, taking the systems approach. So basically, we learn about the systems, everything from our cognitive system to our emotional system, to our social systems, to our planetary system, to our physical and energetic systems that keep us well. But then for the leaders and executive teams, this is the moment where, we do deep dive, 8-week-long cohort-based labs where we can have those more intimate and difficult conversations, where we can support each other, build the kind of trust and collaboration and empathy that's needed for executive teams and leaders. But then very important for me is that everything is actionable. It's no point knowing these concepts if we don't actually practice them. And again, from a behavior change standpoint, it's really hard to make these changes on your own. We need a community of support. So that's what I try to do with my with the Systematically Well programs. And so that's my message to the teams is how can we start to think about the future of the business within the context of the future of humanity. And that might sound really grand, but actually it's not. And hopefully everyone is, now that, based on everything that we've discussed so far, hopefully everybody is seeing those interconnections, but more importantly, the interdependence between our inner and outer systems.
Love that. Love that. And I'm going to ask this too, because you went there with the programming and systematically well. I think that type of education, especially in that space, is still fairly new, right? I mean, that's still a pretty new paradigm in the world of business. And we experience this at Allen Key when we bring our programming, which we've talked about prior, is very similar.
Yeah.
Less focused on the biology and the sciences and more about the emotional and mental awarenesses of self to be able to then make better decisions and know what your motions and patterns are in those states. But those paradigms are still very new in the world of business. And my curious question is, when you have an opportunity to go into those places and talk to groups of people, leaders specifically, where do you start? Like, where do you start with that education with people to really allow this to be sticky and for these concepts to be adopted, and then also even seeing the full cycle, that realized cycle of like, wow, this actually impacts us. It's actually, I feel different. My team is different. Maybe we've seen an outcome in our projects or our larger company at large. Where do we start with Systematically Well?
Yeah. A lot of the times, thankfully, thanks to the work that I've done and through my network, I'm very lucky that, I get referrals and I don't have to do a ton of outreach. But usually the pain points that leaders and teams bring to me is what we've already talked about, which is like we're experiencing a lot of stress. There's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of burnout. Sometimes, people will allude to the higher rates of mental health issues that they're having, from loneliness to anxiety and depression. And I think people are really hungry for evidence-based strategies because, there's no dose of content out there, right? So, and which is a great thing. I think it's really good that we've kind of democratized access to content, but then it can also be very confusing for somebody who's not familiar with these topics. And so I think, what you're doing with Allen Key, sort of like on those inner capabilities, those emotional and mental capabilities that people don't even give themselves permission time to think about and reflect on, is fantastic. And then sort of, what I bring to the table is, let's make sure that we're optimizing our biology in the best way possible. So I think that's a great way to sort of address the pain point. And then in terms of outcomes, in an ideal world, we would be doing blood draws on everyone and tracking inflammatory levels and parameters, but that's not possible. But we can look at, so I'll give you one quick example, is in the cohort-based labs. For example, I remember there's one financial team that we worked with, and through the lab, what emerged, in addition to them, taking steps to optimize their own personal health and well-being, they really, especially we had a huge, there's one system that we talk about, the workplace system and a burnout system, so individual and team burnout. And through that conversation, it was like a spark went off, and they said, oh wow, we had no idea that the way that we were rewarding or not rewarding our colleagues, or the way that we were prioritizing or not prioritizing our workflows, or the way that we were sort of falling short of aligning transparency with our stated values, and the effects that was having on attrition and on team morale and burnout. And so for me, those kinds of qualitative outcomes are super valuable as well. Because that's when the team can say, oh, here's an opportunity. And again, I always take a solutions-focused mindset, right? This is not about shaming or blaming or, it's about coming at this through a lens of great self-compassion and really shifting our mindset and asking ourselves, how can we do better by our own health, but how can we do better by our team's health as well?
Oh man, and the thing that's coming up to share and reflection for where you start, which I think is a beautiful place, from compassion and recognizing, like, yeah, we're human, we're doing this, and we are conditioned by the systems in which we were brought up in, and the external factors that have shaped who we are, and then obviously our genetics. And then, I think, the thing that's coming up to share and reflection for where you start, which I think is a beautiful place, from compassion and recognizing, like, yeah, we're human, we're doing this, and we are conditioned by the systems in which we were brought up in, and the external factors that have shaped who we are, and then our obviously our genetics. but that one of those first kind of turnings, as I'll call it, is when you become aware of those things. Wow, like we're doing this and it's having this effect, or whoa, I feel this way when X or Y. Like that type of awareness like turns over the stone, and you can then say, oh, what's next? Which I love that you then go deeper into those practical tactics and strategies to be able to change those, not only on an individual level, but a team level. So that's amazing. And I'm super grateful that you're in this space with us, doing this work in the world. So I could keep going for like 3 more hours, but we don't have that much time. But I do have one more question that I like to ask folks to think about, because again, much like you, I love this idea of practicality, and I love this idea of implementation. Like a big part of our system revolves on this idea of integration, and that once you become aware, have more awareness about certain areas or pillars in your life, you then take the integrative steps to move them into motion through the simplest of actions to begin to turn the dial on things like your habits and your day-to-day living. So the integrative piece is really important to me. So my question for you is that if you could kind of look at your body of work and the knowledge that you have and put it in a box and knock on somebody's door and say, here you go. Like, this is the piece of wisdom that I want to offer you that may give you your own turning. What would be in that box from you to them for them to learn and take into their lives?
That's a really tough question to summarize everything, but maybe I'll leave folks with one thought that we haven't spoken about overtly, but which is encompassed in everything that we said. It's one of my favorite quotes. It's from this exceptional biologist by the name of Janine Benyus, who is she created this whole concept of biomimicry. And she says that life creates conditions conducive to life. So basically, I would love for folks to reflect on that quote and what that means, and to really reflect on their life, right? So when we say that life creates conditions conducive to life, what Janine is referring to is that in nature, every bacterium, fungus, virus, plant, and animal is living a life that is collaborative and regenerative for the entire ecosystem. And for us as human beings, how can we, because we are part of that same system, and we seem to have kind of moved a little bit away from that paradigm. So my offering to everybody listening is to just take some time and ask yourself, how is your life conducive to life in general? And hopefully that will get them curious about their biology. Think about the impact that you want to have in your life and ask yourself, how can I take care of my biology in such a way that I can then go out there and make the difference in the world that I want to?
What a wonderful gift that would be. I would welcome that gift. I'm sure everybody listening is welcoming that gift. So thank you for sharing that and your time with us today, Parneet. This has been such a fantastic conversation. Probably not our last. I have many spokes that I'd like to go into episode number 2 with you on, just in detail, because I'm so just insatiably curious about some of the topics we touched on today. But for everyone listening who is meeting you for the first time or wants to learn more about you and the work that you're doing out in the world with Systematically Well, where can people find you?
Yeah, it's very simple. You can go to systematicallywell.com or parneetpal.com. They'll take you to the same website. And reach out to me. Reach out to me if you're curious about the programming. There's some information on the Systematically Well suite of programs. And you can watch a lot of my talks that I've given on these topics and podcasts. And yeah, I'm always happy to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. So much gratitude for this conversation. I learned a ton. I'm sure the audience felt tremendous amounts of value from the wealth of the wisdom that you shared with us today. Thank you, Parneet, for your time. We're so grateful.
Thank you so much for having me, Phil. This was really fantastic.